Welcome to Health System CIO's interview with Esmond Kane, Chief Information Security Officer with Steward Health Care. I'm Anthony Guerra, founder and editor-in-chief. Esmond, thanks for joining me.
No problem, Anthony. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Very good. Esmond, can you start off by telling me a little bit about your organization and your role?
So I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for a multinational healthcare delivery organization called Steward Health Care. We're in 9 states domestically in the US. We're in 4 countries internationally. There's about 40 or so hospitals nationally, and then about 10 hospitals and clinics internationally. It's big.
It's big. Yes, it definitely sounds big. Can you tell me a little bit about your career path, how you wound up in healthcare, in security, that type of thing?
That's an interesting question. So I started down the IT track. I was a geek, for lack of better expression, in the west coast of Ireland. Wasn't necessarily known for some of its technical aptitude, and I certainly found it very limiting. So when I made my way to the big cities for college and co, I started to really find my feet in a technical aspect and gravitated towards IT professions. Had my own stint as an entrepreneur, and then I kind of fell into working in the States. It kind of fell into that path that a lot of other IT practitioners do, working their way up from the help desk, desktop, networking, and then into a management role. And then there, about 10 or 15 years ago, closer to 15, I was very lucky to be headhunted by the then CISO for Harvard University, where I was working. And he was very appreciative of the program I had built in one of the divisions in Harvard. And he said, listen, I want you to come do that for me and do it for all the rest of the school. So I sat down with my wife. I had a young family at the time, and I made the decision to kind of take a pivot and a step down and specialize in security. It was a then rapidly maturing discipline. It was starting to become much more professional. It didn't really exist out of a lot of industries outside of the financial sector, and certainly as a discipline, it hadn't really codified outside of the military circles and the intelligence circles. So I made that, and 15 years later, I've been working my way up through the ranks from a security perspective, and now I'm leading a program for a healthcare organization, and it's been really exciting. Continues to be a challenging discipline. And if anybody is looking at cybersecurity, reach out to me on LinkedIn and such. And I love mentoring and coaching, and I'd love to help shape your career and provide what guidance I can.
Did I miss the transition into healthcare specifically? What was your first healthcare role?
Um, so I had worked I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. So it is a hotbed of academia and healthcare. And at some point, most IT and security professionals will probably work in those industries in Boston. So I actually started in Beth Israel in the late 90s, which then became Beth Israel Deaconess and Care Group, and now it's Leahy Health as well. And the last 10 years, I've been in Mass General Brigham and now Steward Health. I find, and I gravitate, Anthony, towards industries where I can align my mission. I find it great and very rewarding to have the perception of giving back, to benefit knowledge. In healthcare, it's even more rewarding. You get to help people on the worst days of their life, and hopefully you're able to turn that around and make it some of the best days of their life. They get to ring that bell, for instance. It's something that I find very rewarding, and from a healthcare perspective, I encourage anybody who is mission driven. There is no better mission, really, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen some LinkedIn posts from people in healthcare that are trying to get talent, sort of reaching out to some of those who have been laid off. The mass Twitter layoffs and Facebook layoffs. There's a lot of layoffs going on in tech, and she appealed to. She even, I think it was a female. She even said, "You're not going to make as much money, but you can be connected to a great mission." So that's part of what it has to be, right? To get to good IT talent, you need them to want to be connected to that mission? Are there ways you go about it, especially in the remote world we're living in? I've heard people say it's important to keep them connected. I don't know if that involves bringing them in. We don't know even know where in is anymore, especially if IT was across the street from the hospital, then in wasn't even in. You still had to go round. So what are your thoughts on keeping folks connected to the mission?
I think I certainly try and find for I don't know if it's me biased, my bias, or me projecting, but I certainly do look for professionals that think different, that have diverse backgrounds. I never really rule out a candidate based upon some certificate or things of that nature. I'm always looking for good candidates, and you never know where you find them. And part of that, to your point, Anthony, is there's some just soft skills and core requirements that I think are necessary to be successful in security, like curiosity, like
Mm,
perseverance. Those are very hard skills to try and instill or teach. You can certainly mentor, but they take years and decades to acquire versus some of the hard skills associated with, technical requirement or something you can boot camp. So, aligning with people that have that approach where that they will learn continually, that they will knuckle down and commit to the effort, and that they will find value in what it is we do as a profession, as an industry. Um, COVID has been brutal on every industry. But unlike most industries, we've had to actually work very closely with professionals, clinicians, and doctors and nurses who were putting their own health at risk. And the unfortunate fact of life is not only did the entire global economy take a hit, there was millions of people that have unfortunately passed away. But the sad fact of life in healthcare is some of those included some professionals that we're trying to help.
hmm
And the caliber of professional you work with, the clinician, I find very rewarding. They force you to excel.
hmm
You want to help them, and I certainly find it very, very rewarding when you're trying to educate, when you're trying to instill some of these controls that unfortunately the bad guys are also trying to attack. The core skill to be successful in healthcare, I tend to be is I tend to find is empathy, right? But that's also the very target of some of these unscrupulous threat actors, where they're trying to exploit people who are in healthcare who are trying to find out about COVID or trying to find out about various issues. And what are the bad guys doing? They're sending them phishing emails. They're planting fake COVID trackers. At this point, there's 2 to 3 healthcare organizations falling victim to ransomware on a daily basis. And you do tend to have to exercise some creativity and innovation. And those are also some of the other soft skills I look for, Anthony, when I'm looking at candidates and engaging. I'm certainly not of the mindset that I'm expecting somebody to have 10 years of experience to work on a help desk, or some of the insane requirements that come out of Silicon Valley. That's not what I do. I'm looking for people that have those core soft skills, and hopefully I will train them up, and hopefully they will find a long-lived career in healthcare cybersecurity.
So you mentioned a few words there in terms of looking for the right talent: curiosity, perseverance, creativity, and innovation. Not so focused on certifications, although I'm sure they're nice to have. They're not going to get you over the line, as it were, over the finish line, just in and of themselves. Those qualities, do you think the interview is the key point at which you will be looking to pick that up? And is it sort of come down to a certain enthusiasm they're bringing to the table? And if you don't feel it, you're just not going to really want that individual on your team, no matter how technically skilled they may be?
It's a good question. By the time most cybersecurity executives are interviewing a candidate, they've already been through a level of HR screening, which I've had mixed opinions on. You know, a lot of automated tools are just scraping for keywords or buzzwords, and a lot of HR screening are just trying to screen out overly mercenary candidates or things of that nature. There is value, I'm not going to dismiss it, but it doesn't necessarily put candidates in front of you that certainly I am 100% confident can be successful in the role. So I tend to follow more of a behavioral interviewing role, and I'm asking questions that may seem inadvertent or may seem you know, misdirected, but really what I'm looking for is to gauge how somebody's thinking on their feet. You know, how they exercised some of these core skills that I'm looking for. And some of that isn't necessarily the professions they've been in. Some of it, it's how they've chosen to exercise extracurricular pursuits. Sometimes it's just their hobbies. It's that kind of enthusiasm that they're able to bring to the table. You know, the bad guys are coming against healthcare hard, right? And that stamina, that perseverance to learn from your failures and make sure that you can do it better next time. Those are things that I certainly look for, and I will ask questions that are trying to drive to the intent of what motivates somebody. You know, what makes them think. You know, if they're presented with a problem space that they've never seen before, how they're going to sink or swim, right? And the answer, for the record of that, is it's perfectly acceptable to Google answers, right? I'm not looking for someone to have like an extensive body of knowledge necessarily. I want someone to know how they can work through a decision tree and eliminate the impossibles. I sometimes describe that as I'm a big fan of finding Watsons, Anthony. You know, I want somebody that does a solid day's work, that will persevere, that will more frequently find those abnormalities. Sometimes in healthcare, because it's not as financially incented as in other industries, you know, it can be challenging to work with, let's say, more of the Sherlocks of the world who are expecting vast compensation, which I can't necessarily do. There isn't necessarily going to be bonuses or incentives or stock options, right? So, you know, I'm looking at other motivating factors for these candidates.
Right. And I mean, as people are working from home, they're not isolated, but there is some degree of isolation there. You need someone who can work a problem, as you mentioned it, who doesn't need to be in, you know, in an old school kind of imagery, knocking on your door every 5 minutes. You know, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Like, people are more off on their own. You need someone who can, again, work a problem and really want to solve it, not just want to check a box that I tried to solve it. Right? There's a difference there.
I would agree. I mean, I do think that somebody that can work independently, they can be successful in some of those roles, but by that same measure, there's also people who work well collaboratively, who will work through a problem. You know, I think solving for the unknown, you know, answering the great uncertainty, which is a huge element of cybersecurity, is a challenge. And you know, it's not some Hollywoodized one where somebody's looking at a screen full of gibberish going, "That's it, eureka, we got it." You know, it's they're working through data and they're ruling out what isn't feasible, and then they're getting to whatever's left, however improbable. You know, that's really what I'm looking for. And there's also an element of this which is I want people to understand probability, because the pace of change sometimes that the threat actors are coming at us, you may never get to 100% certainty, right? You know, there's certainly an appetite to think in absolutes, but you know, the rate of change of the threat actors, the kind of pace at which we need to operate is you need to be comfortable sometimes extrapolating and saying it's more likely this than not that. So let's work from that and then kind of see where it takes us. But by that same measure, you don't want somebody who's going to doggedly exhaust every single thing. At some point, you do want to see them acquire some gut, some instinct.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of contradicting what I said earlier, but those are kinds of certainly what we look for. Yeah.
Well, I don't think you're contradicting yourself. I think it's the gray area, it's the balance, it's that combination of skills, it's knowing when enough is enough. It's knowing, you talk about probability. Probability is risk, right? It's the same thing. Your whole world of security, the CISO's world is based on risk, right? Because nothing's 100%. So, and from what I understand, all the conversations I've had, it's communicate. One of your most important roles is communicating the level of risk to people who are going to make the decisions about whether or not they want to accept the risk you as you have described it. Here is the risk overall in any particular area. Here's the risk. And then I suppose there could be scenarios for here's what I can do to reduce this risk if you're uncomfortable. I need to hire more people, or I need more money, I need to buy more software, or we need to change a process, or this or that. But tell me your thoughts. Is that kind of the role? Is it because people have told me we're the chief risk officer?
Yeah, I mean, I would wholeheartedly agree. I think there's so much of what you just mentioned that we could probably spend hours talking about. But just focusing on the core role there of being a trusted advisor, of giving good information and communicating and interpreting this massive ream of jargon, and then trying to put it in front of a business lead, and then aligning your program to those business needs. I mean, that's so important. You'd also talked about the appetite there to quantify, right? And to get to determinations, you have to understand. Certainly, my expectation is that your goal is not to eliminate risk. That's not possible, right? Business growing, just the journey and kind of the avenues we're working with, the internet in particular, are fraught with risk, right? So your goal is to make sure that you can grow the business securely, right? That you can bake in some of these core decision-making skills so that your business leaders have confidence that they can absorb risk, but that they can manage it appropriately. That's your role. I do see sometimes some of my peers in both healthcare and other industries are on an evolution to become chief trust officers, above and beyond those chief risk officers who are looking at like clinical, financial, cyber. There's a huge element of patient safety and patient assurance there, right? With so many healthcare organizations falling prey to these unscrupulous adversaries, you need to be comfortable stating to your leads that it's practical, pragmatic. These threats will happen, and we will do our best to overcome them. It's our journey to be becoming a resilient organization. Andy Ellis, formerly Akamai, has a great analogy which I tend to use. Which is that cybersecurity leaders are unlikely to be the main character in the story, right? And the main character in a healthcare space is probably the doctors or the patients. So it's your job as a cybersecurity lead to be the sidekick, right? And it is your job to be the best sidekick you can be. It's an analogy that I take to heart, and I thank Andy for the analogy.
Communicating risk to a business leader. What are your thoughts around that? I wonder if there's a concern. I'm sure there's a concern sometimes. When they say there's marriage counseling, you say something, and the other person is supposed to repeat what they think you meant, or what they think you said, to make sure people are understanding each other. And I wonder if it's that kind of thing where the CISO says to the CEO, now, here's what I'm telling you about the risk level. Now, repeat back to me what I said so I know you understand it. Um, and obviously, the CISO has to speak the CEO's language, not the other way around. But what are your thoughts on making sure, after you leave that meeting, so to speak, or that board meeting, that they understood the level of risk that you were trying to communicate?
Oh, that's a tough question, but it's a good one. And thank you for sharing your journey with marriage therapy.
Yeah, well, we're not there. We're not there yet, but we could be. That would be
Hey,
very
listen,
funny.
therapy is a great analogy for some of what we do, right? Your role when you're advising business leads is to make sure that they're they're making good decisions. They're choosing effective strategies that you are confirming and validating the valid, and you're making sure that you don't validate the invalid. That tends to create a toxic scenario. So I do think therapy is a ripe analogy. Sometimes I think when we think of cybersecurity, it's in terms of conflict and combat. And, sometimes that can create its own ethic where everything is a battle. When is it not? And there is an analogy sometimes that we have to get cybersecurity right 100% of the time, and the bad guys only have to get it right once. That's a recipe for self-destruction.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right? Because you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. And if that's what you're communicating to your leads, you're going to have an uncomfortable conversation when they turn around to you and say, we spent X on Y and you didn't see A, B, and C coming, right? That's kind of some of the conversation. But to kind of reverse course and go back to your conversation about dialogue with boards and putting reports in front of them. I think it's good to know your board. Cyber skills aren't guaranteed on a lot of boards. So some of that is you do tend to focus on executive charisma. You do tend to try and provide assurance, and then you try and provide a high level kind of view which the layperson can absorb, but then you want to be able to speak to all of the data. So you do need to have a quite large and extensive appendix in some of these board decks on occasion. Traffic light protocols tend to be used quite a lot. More than anything, I tend to find when you talk to a board member, the simple question will, or indeed a senior leader, what do you see as our risks? And I can be quite surprised sometimes on what people see as risks. Some of them are very acute when it comes to cybersecurity, and some of them are just taking a different direction, which can be quite fascinating. But you should have that regular cadence, and you should make yourself available for board members and security leads. If the only time they see you is when you're reporting out on an incident or a bad event, you're the department of oops, no, right? That's not a role to be in. To use the therapeutic analogy again, there's disciplines where you're invited to say yes, right? There's entire movies based upon the concept of saying yes. So this journey of security is how you can empower and incent, and the compliance efforts, the security efforts, the incidents. The kind of dialogue becomes how do you turn those into speed bumps, not roadblocks, right? How do you not have to all of a sudden reverse course and travel down a different route? And it really depends on the caliber of the board member, the caliber of the senior leader that you're talking to. Certainly establish regular cadence, establish metrics, and then almost immediately present them in a layperson analogy. It can also be helpful for the record, Anthony, to look at what other leaders are having success within the board. And for instance, in the healthcare space, if there's a clinical dashboard that the board is accustomed to seeing, or a hospital management dashboard, well, you've just got a template for how you should be presenting security. It's a framework they can understand. I will also state in closing that I mentioned how cybersecurity skills aren't necessarily the status quo in most boards and senior leadership. So I do think there's value in that kind of cyber risk 101 conversation and coaching session. Hit them where it hurts, hit them self-interest, what executive protection looks like, how they can sanitize their own media, how they can look after their own family, choose good passwords, password managers, MFA, so if you can appeal to their self-interest, and then talk about how that extends to your corporation. I sometimes joke with my leaders that I should become the chief door officer, because I use analogies around doors and locks and basement windows and things of that nature quite a lot.
And how about the analogy you mentioned, which to me, as a lay person, as it were, would be the simplest one, the traffic light, the red, yellow, green, in terms of conveying risk, right? If I was some sort of executive, I would think it'd be very easy for me to look at a report and say, okay, I don't want to see any red, right? If I see red, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. Show me yellow, show me green, try and get the yellows to green, the reds have to go. Is there some of that when you're conveying risk to business people where it's that simple in terms of the methodology you're using?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking there to kind of tertiary analytics or kind of meaningful metrics. You know, you're going above and beyond, like, here's how many fishes we stopped, here many fishes got through. Now you're talking about, like, you know, susceptibility to potential ransomware. You're getting into kind of maturity from an educational perspective. You know, so yes, absolutely, you can do that, but by that same measure, you need to be able to speak to the facts. You need to be able to stand behind your data before you're going to dump something down to a red indicator. You better have strong metrics behind it.
No, and that's what you mentioned. So somebody like me might look at that page, first page, and say, "Oh, okay, I like that. It's green. I'm good." But you may have other board members that want that second and third level. And you mentioned the appendix and the data. You might get someone to dig down to that third and fourth level. And as someone responding to the board, when you get that board member that's at that granular level, you have to be able to answer every question, and all the data's got to be tight, and they can't be pointing out any discrepancies in your data, right?
Well, so the other aspect of both threat and risk there is it's not a stateful or a static event, right?
Mhm.
So usually a lot of boards that I talk to, that they're interested in the trend over time, right? So they're interested in you know, a spark line, or they're interested in kind of like a maturity curve or even a Harvey ball or something of that nature. And they're also looking at peer level benchmarks. So it's like, okay, well, what do we need to do to get to the next step? What do we need to do to level up, right? And when we do level up, what does it mean that our capabilities are, right?
Mhm.
The sad fact of life is the ransomware actors are also innovating, right? So there's a couple of core things you include in every deck. It's kind of like, here's where we are, here's where the industry is. Here's like some of the headline grabbing incidents that everyone's aware of. It's good to include data on the regulatory exposure as well. There's lots of things happening at the federal space. Tends to be slow, but things are certainly heating up. Things like the Patch Act and medical
Mhm.
devices are really starting to garner some attention in Washington, which is exciting. The White House executive orders are really exciting. And that's even before you get to things like GDPR or you know, some of the Canadian privacy and other kinds of ones. So you also need to add to those metrics, well, what do you need to do to get to it? You know, heat maps, I have a love-hate relationship with them, because there's a perception that if you spend more money, sometimes you're eliminating the risk, which in my experience isn't necessarily the case. There's a story there that you need to tell. But as with all stories, you want to make sure that it resonates with the audience who are listening. If you're going to sit there and just bore them to death, you know, especially on a virtual or a Zoom call with a board, you're going to hear somebody snoozing pretty quickly, right? Or snoring, or worse again, you know, God forbid you get a toilet flush, and you have failed when you're reporting out to the board.
What about just cut off like Esmond? Thank you. We're done. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a tactic you tend to do in most board meetings where you say, okay, that's interesting, let's noodle on that one, and then you turn around and say, because you know you've got a large deck to get through, it's like, let's come back to that. I'll schedule sometimes. There's a couple of core mechanisms you can
Yeah.
use. Board members are very much aware of them, but you know, most boards are interested in asking good questions and being confident that there's reasoned analysis and that there's a plan to answer some of those questions. So, you know, I tend to find that different boards, they operate differently, but a lot of them are doing the same thing. They want to know, can they trust you? They want to know if there's exposure. They want to know if the business can continue in its current route or needs to change.
All right, we have time for about one more question. I would be remiss if I didn't ask this sort of open-ended question to get your thoughts. What would you say is the most important trend that you're seeing that healthcare CISOs should be following and preparing their organizations to deal with? What's the number one thing you're looking at?
Okay, let me think about that. The number one most important trend. I mean, existentially, it's ransomware.
Mm.
I worry a lot about this exodus from Silicon Valley, creating a right talent pool for the threat actors to kind of tie into. And now you've gone beyond the industrial age into kind of the hyperspeed lightsaber age for some of these threat actors. There's increasing regulation. There's definitely an appetite at the federal level to kind of encourage healthcare to do more. I mean, thinking about those two things, if there's one thing I'm tracking right now, it is that you are communicating effectively, that you're not misstating the threat landscape, and that you have certainly, if you look at like Joe Sullivan or Mudge, probably the number one thing I'm looking at here is to make sure that I'm sticking to my values, that I'm communicating effectively, that I'm being pragmatic on the risks, and you know, as a CISO, that the profession is changing, and I want to make sure that I'm creating an environment for my team to be successful, that I'm creating programs that are based in reality, not delusions of control. You know,
I love that.
that's probably the number one thing I'm tracking right now, that I'm continually looking at myself in the mirror and going, are you providing value, right? And it's to go back to your therapy analogy, it's that kind of like self-check. It's
Yeah.
that radical acceptance where you're saying, I could have done this better, or we need to start thinking about this. It's that kind of feedback loop. If there's anything I'm tracking right now, it's more internal than necessarily external.
So fascinating that you mentioned the folks being laid off from Silicon Valley could be poached by the bad guys. That never crossed my mind. So that's really interesting. One more quick follow-up and I'll let you go. You mentioned sticking to my values. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
I think one of the hard things to do in security is you're going to get continually distracted by you know, the threats. It's far too easy to enter analysis paralysis. It's far too easy to think that the latest and greatest software solution is going to solve the problem for you. My values, the programs that I build are based upon, you know, doing the right thing, you know, minimizing regret, you know, making sure that what you're doing is future proof, but it's also based about being an authentic leader. It's you know, cut the BS. It's having those honest conversations. It's with your staff and with your leadership, really. That to me are core values that I learned at my mom and dad's knees. And the other thing I'll mention very quickly, Anthony, is my dad emigrated to the US when he was 60. So you know, I have massive amount of respect and honor for the US to recognize that someone of that age could continue to contribute, because he did, and he worked his ass off, and you know, I followed in his steps, and you know, I continued to do what he taught me, which was to work damn hard, and you know, as Dan Gear says, abide by your handshake, you know.
Well, that's excellent. You mentioned minimizing regret. That's I base my whole life on that, good or bad. I try and live my life to minimize regret. So wonderful interview, Esmond. Truly, learning from your parents' knee at on the west coast of Ireland. A beautiful talk, and I think our readers and listeners are going to appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.